Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So once again, since this is recorded, please take a look at your Putra Blast, yeah, and also Wednesday class is postponed. Okay. Yeah. So today we're looking at the third assignment. Sorry, the third presentation, which is theories of second language learning. Theories of second language learning. I put this up on Putra Blast last week, so I think some of you have had the opportunity to look through this. Okay, so generally we can think in terms of language learning having three major positions with respect to language learning. One is a behaviorist position. Okay, from the perspective of theory, yeah. Okay, one is a behaviorist position. The second is an innatist position. The third is an interactionist position. Okay, so we're going to look at all three positions, yeah, and to some extent also look at how grammar is treated in each of these positions. Okay, so the behaviorist position is probably the position that has, you know, the first position with some form of scientific kind of support. Yeah? Okay. So, if you have forgotten, then you can go back and take a look at, your notes. Okay. Educational psychology. So basically, it's trying to say there's a stimulus and there's a response, and you give some form of reinforcement. Um, then you basically can form habits. Basically, yeah, you can form habits. Okay. So there's a lot more to it, but the idea is that language learning is habit formation, and the concern is to form habits and to get automatic response. Okay, automatic response. That means, maybe some of the reasons why this was initially so accepted was because with language itself, many of the things that we speak is automatic. We don't think too much about it. Okay, so the whole deal here was that if you can form habits, then they become automatic, and you don't have to think too much about it. Okay, so to the behavior is what is important is what is observable. Yeah, and this is a very important point. What is important is what is observable. What occurs cognitively, okay, what happens inside your head, is not necessarily important. Yeah, according to the behaviorists. Okay, because behavior is a reflection of what happens in your mind of thinking. Okay, so for them, it's not so important to get people to think about things, but to get them to do something. Because when they do something and they do it automatically, or it's a habit, then it's a reflection of their state of mind, or it's a reflection of their thinking or their cognition. Okay, so for that purpose, you have a lot of drill and practice, because there's no discussion, there's no talking about things that much. It's just doing things, and eventually through doing things, it becomes a habit, and you learn it. And you know. So errors are seen as first language habits interfering with the acquisition of a second language habit. Okay, so you know that's one of the ways to look at errors according to behaviorism. Yeah, and because you want to establish habits, so you don't want other habits which are interfering to be involved or interfere with the learning of a second language habit. Okay, So you don't want errors. Essentially, you don't want errors. Okay, you don't want errors. You want the learners to say the right thing all the time, and you want them to say it. After a while, it becomes automatic and it becomes a habit. Okay, and during this time, during behaviorism and audiolingual method, okay, there was a hypothesis which was referred to as the contrastive analysis hypothesis. Okay, and the idea is that the more similar the second language is to the first language, the easier to acquire. Okay, because it is just transfer, no interference. Okay, if it is different, then it's going to interfere. Okay, that's the idea. If it is different, if you're learning a second language and your first language is so different from the second language, you don't want the first language to interfere because it's different. It's going to interfere with your learning of the second language. Okay, so if it is similar, then it's easier to learn. If it's different, it's going to interfere. Okay, if it is similar, then transfer, simple positive transfer is going to happen. If it is different, then there's going to be interference. Okay, from one perspective, this sounds very logical. Yeah, if it is similar, it's easy to learn. If it's different, it's more difficult to learn. Yeah, but this is not always true. Yeah, if it is somewhere in between, if it's not so similar but not so different, okay, um, it's actually quite difficult to learn. Yeah? Like for example, um, th sounds. Okay, th sounds are not the same, but they're similar to the t sounds, right? In Malay, for example, the th sound is not there. Okay, we don't have a th sound. I don't think we have a th sound. Okay, so but let's say another sound where we don't have like what sound don't we have in English that we have in Malay? What consonant? F. F. There's F, right? Okay. But the point I'm trying to make is TH is similar to T, but sometimes it's very difficult for us to distinguish between TH and T. Okay, and that's not because of the first language. Okay, so it's not an issue of how similar, it's not always an issue of how similar or how different a language is from the language that you want to learn. Yeah, sometimes when it is so different, it becomes so obvious. Yeah, and you can notice it. Okay, because it's so different, right? And it becomes so obvious, right? But if it is just slightly different, you don't notice it because it is like kind of hidden. So it's not quite right to say the more similar it is to the first language, the easier to acquire. The more different it is, the more difficult it is to acquire. Because sometimes when it is very, very different, it becomes so obvious, and we know how to tell that it's different. Okay. So anyway, going back to behaviorism, as I mentioned, pattern drills are seen as essential. Okay, and this led to what is known as the drill and kill, or the 5-phase drill. Yeah, I don't know whether we talked about this last semester, because sometimes it's always deja vu for me, because I've been doing this so many times. I don't know whether it is with you or with somebody else. But anyway, there is something called the 5-phase drill, and I'll take a look at whether we can see this 5-phase drill here. Okay, so I will stop share and I will share this 5-phase drill with you. Okay, this is the 5-phase drill. Okay, there is a stimulus, like for example, kick the ball. the expected response which the student is supposed to give is he kicked the ball. This is like turning present tense into past tense. Okay, so stimulus is the first phase. Response is student's response. He kicked the ball, and this is often used in a language lab, very traditional language lab, where you have headphones on. Okay, and you hear the feedback. He kicked the ball. Okay, and you are supposed to reinforce what you have given by repeating the right answer. He kicked the ball. Okay, so this is reinforcement, and this is phase 4. And phase 5 is consolidation, which is you hear it again. Okay, so you hear again the right answer, which is he kicked the ball, to consolidate your learning of the past tense. Okay, and of course, this is only one sentence, and you can have many sentences all about the past tense, where you're repeating this over and over again. Of course, with different kinds of words. Okay, so you can imagine, yeah, this is the 5-phase drill. This is the extreme case, but this is the example that was given, yeah, or that is given to indicate how behaviorists feel people should learn the language through habit formation, through always repeating what is correct and avoiding errors which could interfere with the formation of the right habits. Okay, so that's the 5-phase drill. And let me just take a look at this. This is the chat here. Oh, it's not for me, it's for somebody else. Okay, never mind. And we go back to this presentation, and still on behaviorism. Okay, and these are the behaviorist conditions for learning in general. Okay, first is the law of exercise. So the learner must respond actively and repeatedly to a stimulus, just like in the 5-phase drill. Okay, the stimulus itself is immaterial. Okay, stimulus is not important. Just like in Pavlov's dogs, yeah, his experiment, there was a bell and there was food. Okay, so the stimulus was food. The response was the dog salivating. Okay, and there was a bell as well. Yeah, so after a while, he took away the food and he just used the bell. So to him, that meant that the stimulus is not that important. After a while, it becomes what's important is the response, right? Okay, so in language learning, it's the same thing. The stimulus is not so important, it's the response, at least from the behaviorist point of view, because you want to form habits. Okay, and that comes from the learners who provide the response, not the teachers who provide the stimulus. Okay, so first is the law of exercise. Secondly is the law of effect. If the response is rewarded, learning is more effective. Okay, so there is reinforcement here. Okay, so I know many of you, some of the lecturers maybe tell you that when you teach, if they give you good answers, you give them sweets or something like that. And I don't know when you were in school whether your teachers did that. Okay, but I do notice that when I go out for teaching practice in the past, okay, sometimes some of the teacher trainees, okay, they bring a whole basket of sweets, and then when they ask questions, somebody answers with sweets. I don't know whether that's really a good thing to do. You're using a lot of money doing that, and then you're not, you're not giving them nutritious food. Sweet will just, just not good for their teeth. Yeah. But anyway, it's the law of effect. It's reinforcement. Okay. So I'm not saying that this is all not correct or cannot be used. Of course, you can use reinforcement occasionally, but not as something that is the theory behind the own learning. Okay, so first the law of exercise. Secondly, the law of effect. Okay, and thirdly, the principle of shaping. So you're doing this basically so that you can kind of like pattern their responses. Okay, this is the idea of teaching and learning, that you try to shape their behavior. Okay, through the behaviorist conditions for learning. Okay, so you have exercise, you have reinforcement, and there are many different things that you try to do. Okay, and eventually it all leads to trying to shape their behavior. Okay, so applied to language learning, what you have is number one, get students to utter the same pattern repeatedly. Number two, get them to do this correctly, avoiding mistakes. Okay, this is the law of one is law of exercise, and then you have the law of effect. Okay, knowledge of the correct answer is the reward. Yeah, here it's not okay. I did give you the example of giving sweets out. Okay, but that's being kind of like extreme. Okay, in some ways. So the idea is that knowledge of the correct answer is the reward, and they'll be happy with the reward. Okay, they know what the right answer is. They know that they have got the right answer, then they are rewarded. Okay, and they are reinforced. Okay, so do this by grading the structural patterns, that is introducing them one at a time. Okay, so this is the whole idea. You're trying to shape their language learning, so you provide them with one pattern after another, and then eventually at the end they get all of the patterns. Okay, so this is behaviorism applied to language learning and reflected mostly in audiolingualism. Okay, or the audiolingual method. Yeah, and there are of course some issues with behaviorism. Okay, number one is errors and overgeneralization. Okay, as we know, sometimes these errors actually tell us something. Okay, somebody who says, if you're teaching past tense, for example, and you say everything is ed, okay, at the end, like for example, walk becomes walked, and so on and so forth. Then, some people may overgeneralize and say that go becomes goed, yeah, because you said that everything is ed, right, to make it into past tense. So this is an overgeneralization. Okay, so an overgeneralization is of course something, because you're focusing on the patterns. Okay, so sometimes the students can overgeneralize and make an error. Okay, so now we feel that errors are useful in some ways, because it um, tells us how the students are um, viewing the issue, or looking at, or trying to understand the structure. Okay, so it gives us some idea of how to approach those students. Okay, so errors are now seen as something which is useful in some ways. Of course, it's not like we want them to always make errors, but if they do make errors, we can use them as a teacher to understand how they are, how they are trying to figure out how the language works. Okay, I'll come back to this, but number three here is interest and motivation of students. Okay, so if you look at the 5-phase drill, okay, I think you can understand that going through language drill, or going through this kind of a drill can be very boring, right? I mean, you're going through this and you're having to repeat everything that you hear, and it doesn't really make any, you may not even understand what it means, but you're just repeating what you hear. Okay, so and this is in relation to this meaning. There is a lack of meaning in when you deal with behaviorism, because as I mentioned in the earlier slides, with behaviorism, uh, what happens in the mind or cognitively is not so important, because what they see is said to be a reflection of what's happening inside, what's happening cognitively. So they're not going to pay any attention to what may be happening cognitively, because they're more concerned with what they see, what is observable. Okay, so we know that sometimes things that are not observable are also important, right? Not everything that is observable is important. Things that are not observable may also be important. Okay, so this meaning, the tam titi tam effect. I'll show you a slide and demonstrate what it means. Okay, this is the tam titi tam effect. Okay, so if you have a stimulus kick the ball, your response is going to be he kicked the ball, just like the earlier slide, right? Okay, so if it is walk the dog, you know that the response should be he walked the dog. And if somebody says tam tidi tam the house, you will be able to also answer by saying tam tidi tam the house. But you don't know what it means. Okay, you don't know what it means. So basically, there is no meaning involved, and this is something that goes back to issues of motivation, issues of interest. Because as a learner, all you're doing is just repeating the patterns, and you don't always know what you are talking about. You're just saying things out. Okay, and people can give you any word, and you can just turn it into a past tense by adding ed, but you don't know what it is. Okay, so this is what Julian Dakin, the person who came up with this tam tidi tam effect. Okay, this is what he is saying, that the audiolingual method focuses too much on the structure like this without focusing or without giving any attention to meaning. Okay, so this is an issue with the behavioral structure, because we know that when we learn language, we want to also, understand the meaning. How can we use language and not understand what we say? Okay, that's one of the most essential things, right? You need to understand what you are saying. Okay, so that was one of the issues with behaviorism. Okay, and there is another issue which is referred to as poverty of stimulus. Okay, uh, and this will also be discussed in the innatist view of language learning. There are three, positions. Okay, so as in the first slide, one is the behaviorist position, the other is the innatist position, the third is the interactionist position. Okay, so poverty of stimulus is something which refers to the fact that um, we sometimes do not get to listen to all of language, but despite that, okay, so in other words, the stimulus around us is poor, especially for children. Okay, because even with children, sometimes the mother does not use language which is complicated, very straightforward. Maybe the parents use words that are, baby talk and motherese and so on and so forth. Okay, but eventually, despite the stimulus not being complete, okay, or being poor, ultimately the student or the person or the individual will still be able to pick up or acquire the language. Okay, so if that's the case, then it's not really the stimulus or things around us that will get us to learn the language. There could be something else. Yeah, so this is the issue with behaviorism, because behaviorism, is a stimulus response kind of situation. Okay, so although they say in the end, ultimately the stimulus may not be so important, but it's still there. Okay, the whole theory of position is based on a stimulus response reinforcement kind of format. Okay, so we will talk a little bit more about this, yeah, poverty of stimulus in the innatist position, okay, or the nativist position of language learning. Okay, so the nativist or innatist position of language learning is that children are biologically wired for language, and language develops just the same way other biological functions develop. Okay, just like just like as you grow taller, you don't need to have any kind of um, stimulus except for food maybe. Okay, so it's going to develop naturally. Okay, so language is also something that's going to develop naturally. Okay, so this is the innatist point of view. It does not need, the environment makes only a basic contribution. Okay, only a basic contribution, which is providing the availability of people who will speak to the child. Okay, so the environment of all these people around the child or around the individual will act as input, will give or provide input, language input to trigger acquisition. Okay, of course you need people around you. You need people talking to you, or um, because it's going to, of course, if you're born to a Malay family, you probably grow up and learn and speak Malay, right? You don't learn, you acquire Malay. Yeah. But if you're born to a Chinese family, you're going to pick up Chinese, right? So of course the people around you are the people who are going to influence what language you're going to learn as your first language, right? But none of those people around you are going to formally teach you or have you go through drill and practice like what behaviorism does. Okay, so in other words, what the innatist or the nativist focus on is uh, more what is internal to the individual. Okay, meaning to say there is already uh, a natural tendency to pick up a language. The language will eventually grow and become more complete as you converse with people and as you are exposed to people around you. But the focus is on the individual. Yeah? Motivation to learn is more intrinsic, so it's in the person. Yeah, it's inside. It's completely inside the individual. Okay. So I was talking about the poverty of stimulus argument. This slide, is kind of like explaining this argument a little bit more. Language that children are exposed to contain numerous imperfections and does not provide all the information that children need. Okay, when they say contain numerous imperfections, it's because as a child, the parents speak to the child in a simplified form, modified form. They don't speak to a child the same way they speak to adults. The language that they use is a little bit more watered down. Okay, I'm sure when you speak to your younger brothers or sisters who are still very young, you don't speak as if you're talking to your friends who are of the same age. The language that you use is a little bit modified. It's simplified. Okay, and children are not systematically corrected. Okay, so when they make errors, nobody will just correct them all the time, especially when it comes to grammar. When it comes to miscommunication, yeah, probably, but not so much when it comes to grammar. Okay, so despite this poverty of stimulus, yeah, they can still acquire the language. They can still pick up the language. They can still understand how to use the language correctly and generally how to use it accurately. Yeah? So therefore, there must be some internal natural ability to acquire language. And this is what the innatists or what the nativists focus on. Okay. So, and there is a lot of evidence that can support the innatist position. Yeah. And these are some of them. Okay, number one, virtually all children learn language at an early age, despite how complicated language can be, and so on and so forth. Okay, number two, you have, um, you know, um, they successfully master the basic structure of the language. Yeah, despite some differences in levels, and this is the poverty or stimulus argument. Animals cannot achieve language mastery like children. This is also used as evidence to support the innatist position. Okay, and children acquire language without formal instruction. Okay, So, the emphasis seems to be a lot more on children and also a lot more on first language. Okay. Whereas in behaviorism, it's perhaps more on slightly older students and also can be applied to second languages as well. Okay. But the idea is that instead of habit formation, okay, uh, nativists or innatists prefer to focus on creative construction. Okay, so with creative construction, it's basically relying on internal processing abilities, yeah, that help the students acquire the language. So there is device. Okay, sometimes people talk about language acquisition device, like black box and things like that. Okay, but we don't really know what it is. Okay, but there is a natural ability um, which allows us to process language that we hear and make us understand how the language works. Okay, so that's innatist or nativist, and this is God given from our birth. Yeah, beginning from birth. Yeah, that ability is given. Okay, for every person who is generally healthy and nothing, no you know issues, health issues or anything like that. So unlike behaviorism, speech and writing is the outcome of learning rather than the cause of learning. Okay, so it's slightly the other way around. If with behaviorism, you focus a lot on speech and writing. Why? Because speech and writing are observable. Okay. Behaviorism, they focus on what is observable. Speech is observable. Writing is observable. Okay. With the innatist position, they don't focus on speech and writing that much. And in fact, reading and listening comprehension and interpretation becomes important. And speech and writing is the outcome of learning rather than the start of learning. Okay. So, so in other words, a lot of people talk about the silent period. Okay, the silent period, meaning to say you can keep quiet, or if you are quiet in class, it doesn't mean that you don't know what is happening, especially in learning languages. But you are basically trying to process what is going on. Okay, so and to me, uh, this is also true of say an incident that happened to me and my youngest son. Okay, when we were, I don't know whether I told you this story. uh, when I was studying, yeah, in the US, and because he came with no knowledge of English, so what he did was when he went out to play in the playground, he would just um, you know he would just um, mm, use nonsense words, okay, to communicate with others. Well, maybe that would be an example of the next position, but it's interesting to see how people respond to new language and how they naturally try to pick up the language. Okay, so anyway, here, okay, in this slide, creative construction rather than habit formation. Okay, unlike behaviorism, speech and writing is the outcome of learning rather than the cause of learning. Errors are not completely avoided or forestalled as they are indicators of learning. Okay, even to the learners. Okay, so the idea is that even when you make errors, okay, even if you're learning a language, you make errors. Okay, eventually, um, the kind of reaction that you get from people will tell you that it's an error, and you start thinking about why it's an error, what's wrong with it, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, errors are not something that are completely bad. It's something that actually helps or is natural in the language learning process. Okay. The issue with the nativist or the innatist position is that it's difficult to identify the role of instruction. If it's all, the individual and how they, how they have the ability to pick up language on their own. So what do you do as a teacher? Okay, what is the role of instruction? Okay, so people who generally propose this innatist position like Chomsky, okay, never suggested a particular approach to teaching. Yeah? So they just only said that uh, this idea of trying to learn a language using the behaviorist approach or audiolingual method does not work because their theory behind learning the language does not seem to be very strong. And people learn the language through an innatist you know, uh, this innate position is a stronger argument for how people learn the language. But they never provided a particular teaching approach as compared to behaviorism, where there is drills, where you have all this, the three steps, law of effect, and so on and so forth. So the idea of linguistic performance and linguistic competence is limited. Yeah? So what Chomsky was saying was that um, you have you may know something, okay, which is competence. Okay, you know something inside your head cognitively, but when you perform, when you use it or when you speak, sometimes it does not come out correctly because of various reasons. Okay, but you do know the answers or you do know the structures. So, but all this is happening in your head, all this is happening cognitively. Okay, linguistic competence, knowledge of, how the language works and so on, is something that we as teachers we don't really understand because it's in the head, yeah, in the student's head, it's cognitive. So it's very difficult for us to use this position except just to understand that yes, students or learners do have the ability to pick up the language on their own, without formal instruction. In other words, when they are exposed to language, they will try to make sense of it. They are not a blank sheet where when we tell them A, they will write A or something like that. Okay, because they are themselves thinking on their own as to what or how the language works. Okay, so we have to bear this in mind. Yeah? We have to bear the fact that students or learners, language learners, are also trying to process the language on their own. Okay, we have to bear this in mind as well when we try to teach. Okay, so that's the innatist position. And the third position, okay, you have Gresham's hypothesis, which is a reflection of the innatist position. And actually, we will be talking about this, but because I said that I don't know, I will have to end a little bit early. I'm going to skip this for a while and come back to it later on and look at the interactionist position. Okay. So for the interactionist, what's important is interaction. Okay, interaction. That language acquisition will not occur unless there is some form of interaction. Okay. In other words, uh, you know, um, input or whatever language that you are exposed to, what's important is that you comprehend it, right? Okay, if you are exposed to language, what's important is you comprehend, you understand what what you are exposed to. Okay, what somebody says, you comprehend. Okay, so how does this happen? How is input made comprehensible? First, through interactional modifications. Okay, interactional modifications make input comprehensible. Comprehensible input promotes acquisition. Okay, if you can understand something, you know something in terms of what somebody says to you or something that you read. Yeah, this is all input. Okay, if you can understand it and you understand the connection between the words, etc., the structure, etc., okay, it promotes acquisition. Okay, so the idea here is that in order to make the input comprehensible, you may have to modify the interaction. Okay, you may have to um, intentionally change some things to make it more understandable. Okay, so this is the responsibility of the teacher. Or in some situations, if you don't have a teacher, if you're outside and you're talking to other people, these are native speakers who are sympathetic to you as a language learner. So they speak a little bit slower and things like that. Okay, so the teacher does basically the same thing. Okay, interactional modification. Okay, so there are also conversational modifications and negotiation of meaning. Okay, negotiation of meaning is basically when you have input and you don't really understand what you are exposed to, you don't really understand the input. You have the ability to negotiate the meaning, meaning to say you can ask them clarification of meaning. You can ask the speaker to repeat. You can ask them, is this what you mean? You can paraphrase and so on and so forth. Okay, and all these actions, all these strategies are actually done in order, and it's done naturally as well, in order to understand and comprehend. Okay, and once again through comprehension, which is achieved through interaction. Okay, you acquire the language. Okay, so you know these things happen through interaction. You have to have interaction for you to be exposed to the language, and in this interaction you may depending on who you're talking to or what kind of book, what kind of text you're faced with, okay, you may get simplified input, modified input, and at times you may have also the ability to negotiate the meaning by asking for clarification and so on and so forth, and through that you acquire the language. Okay, so in other words, what's important for interactionists is input in the form of interaction. Okay, and modified input involves some of the characteristics of modified input, especially in speech: slower rate, higher pitch, more varied intonation, shorter, simpler sentence patterns, frequent repetition, paraphrase, and with children, they have this you know, focus on what is here and now. Sometimes difficult to, talk about things which they do not see immediately in front of them. And also this idea of a recast. Okay, a recast means, if somebody says, "I go to school yesterday," you don't immediately just simply say that's wrong. Okay, the right way to say it is, "I went to school yesterday," but you recast their own sentence by repeating it, but repeating it correctly. So instead of, after he has said, "I go to school yesterday," you can say, "Oh, you mean you went to school yesterday?" Okay. Or you can talk to the other students and say, "Right, he went to school yesterday." Okay. And you rely on the students or the learners, um, you know, cognitive ability, their learning device, language learning acquisition device, to figure out that go word is incorrect. Okay, so this is the idea of interactionist. Okay, interactionist position in learning. And when you look at some of these things, these are some of the things that teachers are expected to do in the classroom. Okay, when they talk to their students, slower rate of speech, because you cannot, you're teaching them a new language, and you cannot be talking to them as if you are talking to your student, your colleagues or your friends. Higher pitch, of course, this is relative. it doesn't mean that you're screaming or, or shrieking or something like that. But pitch is used to emphasize certain parts of the word, like for example, if you want to emphasize auxiliaries, then, you use higher pitch perhaps to focus on the auxiliaries so that they can notice them. Varied intonation, and so on and so forth. So this is a part of modified input. Okay. And okay, let me see whether there would be a good time to kind of like, okay, we'll go through this and maybe look through them again later on. But as I mentioned, negotiation of meaning is also important, and these are some examples of negotiation of meaning. Comprehension checks like the bus leaves now. Do you understand? So this can also be happening in class, right? When you're talking to your students. In other words, when you try to strike up a conversation with students. Okay. So in other words, in the classroom, okay, it should not just be one-way traffic in terms of you giving instruction as a teacher, giving instructions to students all the time. But you need to try to also create some form of interaction. And during the interaction, okay, these are some of the things that you should be using as a teacher, okay, in order for you to ensure that the input is comprehensible, right? Okay, you can do comprehension checks, you can do clarification requests. Okay, when somebody replies to you, not very clear, you can say, could you say that again, or whatever sentence you want, as long as it has the same goal of clarifying what was said. Okay, repetition or paraphrase, a word like this, she got lost on the way to school, which is one sentence, and you can break it up into she was on the way to school and she got lost. Yeah, so these are things that help students understand what is being said. Okay, so once again, we have to be a lot more sensitive to the students proficiency levels, and not assume that everybody will be able to understand everything that we say, and we need to change, sometimes modify the input in order for them to comprehend things. Okay, so this interactionist position, some of these things, importance of linguistic and social environment. Okay, it's important. Input, yeah, as we were discussing just now, is also very important, as well as interactional modification. Um, Later on, we'll also be talking about certain models of acquisition, but important conditions for language acquisition would be the input, some form of output from the students, and interaction between the students and the uh, teacher. And the goal is communicative competence, okay, which we will talk about later on. Okay, so and we will, this is the last slide for the moment, and we will probably go back to this again the next time we meet, which will be next week. Yeah? Issues with the interaction position, every position, each of the three positions, they have issues, yeah? They have concerns. With this position, the issue is its implementation in the classroom. Okay, yeah, because we know that the classroom size is often too large, right? And it's difficult to conduct interaction with so many students, and um, and each student may, they're not all the same. Yeah? Each student may respond in different ways with respect to trying to understand the input. Okay, so there are individual differences. Okay, which makes it a little bit more difficult. It's not like you negotiate, or you negotiate meaning, or you interact with 1% in the class and everybody understands in the same way. Okay, so it's kind of difficult in that sense. Secondly, the time required for learning or acquisition to take place is much longer compared to if you were just simply to teach them what the rule is. Okay, so here it's between teaching what the rule is, which is very straightforward and explicit, and getting them involved in some form of interaction, some form of negotiation or meaning, which you can create through activities. You can create this through activities. It's not always the teacher interacting with the student, but you can create some activities or you can make some tasks. Okay, you can construct some tasks, and in the process of completing those tasks, they go through or they face input which they must comprehend, and there will be negotiation and interaction within the groups that complete that task. Okay, but the point here is that it will take a longer time compared to, maybe other forms which may not be as effective, okay, but may be more, perhaps for the teachers, more satisfying, yeah, because they think that they have already taught the instruction. Okay. And the target language environment versus the foreign language environment, it's different, right? In target language environment, you can try to do this and they will go outside of the classroom and they will get extended exposure. Whereas in the foreign language environment, you can try to do this, and when they go outside, they're not going to get any more, target language exposure. If you're teaching English in some parts of Malaysia, for example, they go outside, there's no more English being used. Okay, so this interaction is not going to happen outside of the classroom. It's only going to happen inside the classroom. So it's very, very limited in that sense. Okay, um, and one of the problem is many of our education systems are very assessment based, and when it is assessment based, all these things about um, you know uh, interaction and so on and so forth, because it takes too much time, teachers will be pressured, yeah, to not rely too much on this kind of approach and do something which is more straightforward and more explicit. Okay, so the thing is here also, in the next slide we will talk about the difference between the classroom setting and the natural setting. Okay, so anyway, I said that I had to stop a little bit earlier today, and it's already 12. I have something on at 12:30, and I have to prepare because I'm going out to meet people. Yeah. So any questions though? Sorry, this is a kind of like a very fast going through the whole presentation. But if there are any questions, you can ask them now, or you can hold on to them. Yes, Nakiba.
No question.
No question. Okay. Okay, I will stop share. And look out at all of you. Anybody asleep? Okay, everybody is paying attention except for we don't know whether the ones who I do not see their faces. Okay, I don't know whether they're paying attention or not. Okay, but it's okay. It's there on Putra Blast. You can take a look at it again. Okay, I'm going to take attendance in a while. Yeah. So today's date is the 5th. Yeah. Somebody asked me for attendance for last semester. Hmm, I don't know why the immigration wants attendance for last semester, because nobody was here. I mean, no, there were no face-to-face classes. But if you still need it, maybe is it possible to just give a letter or something? Would that work? Hold on. Second page. Yeah, so this thing about visa, right? Visa, the students from China. Okay, you have to, someone contacted me and said that she needed the attendance for last semester. So I'm wondering, is it possible for me to just write a letter to say that, attendance was taken and, but it was not taken using the usual attendance sheet. Okay, it's all pictures like this, capture screens like this. So I'm sure the immigration don't want to see all these capture screens. So can I just write a letter and say that you attended all the classes? I don't know who I'm talking to actually. I'm talking to I can't remember who asked me for it. One of the Chinese students, one of the students from China. Are you here? Okay. So anyway, if it becomes an issue, if somebody raises the question, just tell me and I will, basically that's what I'll do. I write a letter indicating that your attendance was okay. Okay. So if there are no more questions, I will stop here.
Bye, Doctor.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you,
on
Doctor.
Oh, by the way, Imanina, are you still there?
Okay.
Okay. I need a way to get in touch with you. Maybe you email me. Okay, you email me, and I will give you my handphone number. Or do you have my handphone number? Can you get it from Iza? Has my handphone number, right?
All right. I'll
Okay.
ask Iza.
From Iza, you send me a WhatsApp message.
Iza
Okay.
don't have your number,
So
Doctor.
you send me a
I will email you.
sorry.
Iza,
No, I think send me a WhatsApp message so that I can, it's easier, faster actually to do things through WhatsApp. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. See you all next week. Okay. Goodbye. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you.
Okay, Doctor.